Good morning, everybody, and welcome to a beautifully snowy Aberdeen. So this is the final Brodies event in association with Shell and the Chamber of Commerce for the Vanguard series. I'm James BREAM. I'm going to be moderating the session today. Some of you have been to these sessions before. It's going to be quite relaxed, informal, and hopefully a little bit of audience participation. I'm going to come back in just a second, but first of all I'm going to hand you over to our host Drysdale for a bit of housekeeping.
Hi, good morning. As James said, I'm Drysdale Graham, a partner here in the infrastructure team. Just to welcome you to Brodies House on this snowy St Andrew's Day. A few points of housekeeping to keep you in order. The bathrooms are out by reception, turn right. We're not expecting the fire alarm to go off today, so if it does sound, don't panic, just head for that door there, and our staff will guide you out into the snow and give you blankets and stuff to keep you warm. Finally, can you please check your phones are switched off, because mine isn't, I'm still about to switch it off. And just before we start, thank you for all struggling through the snow, and now I'll hand you over to James BREAM, who's the Research and Policy Director at Aberdeen Grampian Chamber of Commerce, who's moderating today's event.
And I'll now tell you to keep your phones on, and you can tweet if you like, and use
I don't know how to tweet, sorry.
Use the hashtag AGCC event. So, fourth event, we've had innovation, oil and gas, food and drink. There was a little bit of controversy in a couple of those, and we've now got infrastructure. So we'll have a bit of chat about infrastructure in the northeast, and just in case Brodies are going to have another one, I think, given though we're moving through that controversy route, we should go for religion and politics next, I think. No doubt there will be some interesting comments coming out. And as we have with the last events, we've got a few questions along the way. I actually, stupidly, only looked at them at the start of the week. And there's a couple in there which will be a little bit controversial, so we'll see how they go. So, as usual, I'm just going to introduce the speakers. The speakers are here because they're experts in their field, and they'll give us 5 minutes on their views around the topics of infrastructure. And we've actually got, I suppose, some specialists today in particular areas. So we're going to start with Drysdale. Well known, I understand, in the infrastructure and particularly social economic infrastructure space. And it was interesting, apparently his colleagues have said that his comments are quick to be noted because of the depth of his industry knowledge. So high praise from colleagues, yeah. But he does get involved in areas which I suppose a lot of us around the northeast maybe are less familiar with: public-private partnerships, the Scottish Futures Trust, and his regular meetings with Cabinet Minister speaking about infrastructure. So, our first 5 minutes, Drysdale, over to you.
Thanks very much, James. I just thought I'd give you an overview of where I thought things were getting to with infrastructure in Scotland, in particular with reference to where we are, City and Shire, and where we started from 2 or 3 years ago. I suppose I used my starting point, a document which will be well known to Belinda here, and that's the SWOT analysis for the Aberdeen City Region Deal Plan, and that identified a significant infrastructure deficit in the northeast of Scotland. And I guess what everyone around this panel has been trying to do over the last few years has been to work out ways of addressing that infrastructure deficit to the benefit of City and Shire, and to increase employment in the area, in particular in the context of what's been happening in the oil industry in Aberdeen. I think it's fair to say there's been significant progress over the last few years, and probably been as much project activity in this neck of the woods in Scotland as anywhere in Scotland in terms of what's being their boots in the ground and spades in the earth. The Aberdeen bypass is nearing completion, believe it or not. I know it was discussed for about 20 years, but it finally got off the ground. The completion date is winter quotes 2017/18. I think it's due to complete about April next year. There's been a bit of controversy around the bypass. I think a lot of these projects, which have been procured by the PPP method, the risks are passed down to the construction subcontractor on a fixed price contract. And you'll have seen that some of these contracts, the subcontractors are listed construction companies, and you'll have seen in their annual reports they're carrying losses forward to deal with disputes they're having on these projects. So most major construction projects, you end up with some kind of dispute. Other significant projects in Aberdeenshire recently, the city airport expansion is a great benefit to the area. The new harbour south of Aberdeen is going to prove a huge boon. If the North Link ferry is relocated there, the cruise ships, the deeper harbours for decommissioning. We've also seen Aberdeen as a sort of test ground for some innovative funding models that the Aberdeen City Council bond issue, which raised just under £300 million, a lot of which is going towards the AECC, the new conference centre, which Robertson Construction are building, one of our clients. The Aberdeen City Region deal, which is basically a form of joint funding between the Scottish and UK governments, and which Belinda will be talking about in more detail later on, has provided enabling infrastructure across the region, including around the harbour for roads. The European Investment Bank have been pretty active in the area as well. Unfortunately, post-Brexit, the European Investment Bank will not, we believe, be lending into the UK. The UK currently owns 16% of the European Investment Bank, has a £3 billion shareholding and a contingent liability of just under £40 billion to the European Investment Bank. So that was one of the Brexit negotiation points, and that liability will continue for the duration of the EIB loans in Scotland. But EIB helped fund the new harbour at Nig Bay and Aberdeen Bypass, the M8 and Edinburgh Sick Kids, and a number of major projects in Scotland. We're also seeing in the north of Scotland the impact of what's called the hub procurement model, which is the Scottish Government's means of procuring schools and non-acute healthcare. So you've seen, for example, the likes of Forest Hill Health Centre, Afford Community Campus, Orchard Bray School for pupils with additional sport needs, Lochside Academy. These are all being procured by the hub method, which is basically a joint venture between the health boards, the local authorities and the private sector. We're also seeing the health board procuring directly the likes of Baird Family Hospital and the Anchor Centre at Forest Hill. So again, a lot going on the social accommodation side of things. Unfortunately, this seminar is sandwiched between two budgets, the UK budget on the 22nd of November and what's probably more interest to the room, the Derren McRae's budget on the 14th of December. There wasn't much to excite the horses in the 22nd of November budget for Scotland in particular. I suppose for the oil industry, there's the transferable tax history provisions, which will be a great benefit for the M&A industry in oil and gas. And there was a couple of further city deals announced in Scotland, Tayside and Borderlands. But other than that, there was very little to give encouragement on the infrastructure side of things in Scotland. We're more hopeful in relation to the Scottish budget on the 14th of December. We're expecting a further funding for schools and healthcare. An education infrastructure plan has been promised, covering everything from early learning to colleges. We've also been promised the flesh and the bones of what's been called the Scottish National Investment Bank. And there's a guy called Benny Higgins, who's ex-chief executive of Tesco Bank, who's been tasked with putting together the remit for the bank. But it's going to be a sort of quasi, like 3i started off, sort of lending to SMEs and also potentially lending into infrastructure. So it may help fill the gap that the EIB is vacating when it pulls out of lending into the UK. I think we also might see a reaction to the UK government's stamp duty reforms and whether the limits of the LBTT up here are increased to £300,000 is possible as well. There'll be further stimulus for housing. The UK government was down yesterday meeting the Infrastructure and Projects Authority, which is basically the projects arm of the Treasury in London, to hear what they've been up to. And over the last 5 or 6 years, they've been involved in providing a number of guarantees for projects which are hard to fund. And of the 10 guarantees they provided, 3 of these have been in Scotland, 2 in Aberdeenshire, in particular Countess Wells, and the other one in Scotland was Grangemouth. So they do get involved in areas where funding is hard to come by, and someone needs to cover off the risks of a particular project. Getting my head around too much, right? Just
your words, not mine.
Just to conclude, I think there's a lot to look forward to in City and Shire, and in particular with the City Region programme, which Belinda's going to be talking about. So please feel free to ask me questions about the programme later in the event.
Next up, our man about town, Derren McRae. Derren is well known within the property sector, obviously involved in a number of letting deals in the city itself, but also he's involved in the board of Aberdeen Inspired. He's been in and around the city centre master plan. He studied in Aberdeen, which I didn't know, went away to Glasgow, and like most Dons fans, couldn't wait to get back to Aberdeen. And he's been back here as no crowd participation yet, thanks. And he's been MD of the Aberdeen office since 2012. So Derren, tell us about your views of infrastructure in the city.
Thanks, James. I guess as a last-minute sub, there's quite a lot of this information came from James's investment tracker, so if there's any inaccuracies, speak to this man over here. With my commercial property hat on, I'm just going to touch on some of the infrastructure projects that have taken place in Aberdeen and what I see as the outlook. Obviously, the office and industrial sector has been hit as a consequence of the downturn in the energy sector, so we are seeing record supply levels just now. We are, however, seeing pockets of retail and leisure activity, whereas before developers would target energy sector companies for high-profile sites in Aberdeen. We've seen the likes of IKEA, M&S, Starbucks, Costa, Lidl open in some of these locations. We also know there's likes of Tim Hortons, Burger King, McDonald's are still keen to get into key sites, that they now have an opportunity to do that in Aberdeen. The largest on-land infrastructure project is, of course, the AWPR, so there will be a lot of commercial development opportunities thrown up as a consequence of that. To the north, we've seen Aberdeenshire Council give consent to Ashfield Land for their Black Dog mixed-use development. It'll great to see if they can implement this consent and secure a regional food hall as well as a cinema. There's also a business park proposed as part of the plans. My own personal view is I think you'll get a lot of interest in the industrial sector for that key location. I'm not convinced you will see pure office development happen given where it sits in the landscape. I would move across to Dice. We've all obviously seen the major changes that have taken place in Dice over recent years. I mean, hats off. I had an experience landing in our new international arrivals, magnificent facility. I was actually met by a very proactive, happy, cheery passport control who welcomed me to Aberdeen, which must be new. Quickly picked up my bag and again a great new arrivals hall. Jumped in my car onto the Airport Link Road. Award-winning Emerson building on the right, award-winning Aker new HQ on the left. Quickly left onto past the Mammoth new exhibition centre under construction. So that's light years ahead of where we were a few years ago when we were actually quite embarrassed picking up international investors and sitting in traffic on single lane Dice Drive. Next down would be Kingswells. I think it's safe to say that a lot of the commercial property development that's taken place in Aberdeen in recent years, it's actually been as a consequence of the booming energy sector. It's not been largely down to infrastructure. In phase one, you had Apache, Nexon, and Transocean. My understanding is these occupiers, they committed prior to AWPR going on site, and the key drivers for them were it was close to a lot of good quality housing where a lot of their staff live, and also the fact that it was in a properly purpose-built, well-designed business park, no pipe yards, no burger vans. I guess one slight negative is a lot of that oil spend has left the city centre, and some of these buildings are still lying vacant that these occupiers were in. You'll be aware, Drum, the developers of Prime 4, also recently withdrew their application for a retail park at Kingswells. This is largely due down to the fact that the council are, driving forward with their city centre master plan, plus also Bonaccord and Union Square also put in planning applications to expand their retail footprint. I suspect if neither of these centres crack on with the developments once they receive full consent, I reckon the plans will be dusted down for Kingswells. Now, if that scheme was to happen, I'm not convinced you'll see retailers leaving Union Street to go out to Kingswells. What you may find is, a retailer who's got perhaps dual representation in both centres may look to close one of those stores and move out to one of what would be the dominant out-of-town retail park, because that is what's happening across the UK. Finally, I guess a topical one, I am fully supportive of this, vital football stadium for the area, and I wish Cove Rangers all the best at Balmoral Stadium.
Very good. Okay, and thanks for good timing, Derren. Rab is our transport man, so hailing from Alloa, which has now got a new railway. And I'm sure you've been and enjoyed it since you've moved away. He works for Nastrans, so that's a regional transport partnership. Some of you might be aware of that, others not so. And they set out the strategy for transport in a region, so that's bigger projects, but also some of those city-based projects as well, and also look at things like active travel and buses as well. So Rab is one of the experts in our region on these transport issues. So Rab, up for your 5 minutes, please.
Thanks very much, James. I've never heard the word expert before, but there you go. Yeah, for those who don't know, Nastrans are actually a very small team. There's only 8 of us based down in King Street. But we tend to look at the overall strategic and particularly the linkages and support the two councils in bringing together strategic transport policies and anywhere that we can add value. For example, we do all the liaison with Network Rail, ScotRail, Transport Scotland's rail team on the rail matters, rather than having 2 local authorities both dealing with them on what is primarily a cross-boundary issue. In summary, talking about infrastructure and transport infrastructure, and obviously both of the speakers have already mentioned the WPR, but I wanted to say really that it's not just about the WPR, and in fact we've got over £1 billion plus of investment coming into the region in what's really a very short period of time. I think we've probably had about 40 years of underinvestment in transport, and a lot of what you see now is catch-up, I think. Inverramsey Bridge has been a nightmare for many, many years on the A96. Third Dawn Crossing we've talked about for 20 years and more. Now obviously the Diamond Bridge. And as Derren says, that the changes at Dice Drive, including a new park and ride site at Crabeston, are now all complete and available. Ongoing, as well as the bypass, there's obviously the private sector investment in the harbour, the airport, and also Peterhead Harbour. But also a major upgrade to the Aberdeen to Inverness Railway, which will include dualling of the track between Aberdeen and Inverurie, and the potential for a new station at Kintore, which now has compulsory purchase orders approved and should be completed by 2019. And as part of that, and in association with that, we're looking for a local rail service. We've talked about Crossrail for many years. Again, by 2019, we will have a dedicated railway service between Montrose in the south through Aberdeen as far as Inverurie, which will stop at every local station. So places like Portlethen will suddenly have an hourly service as a minimum, and others likes of Dice will have at least a half-hourly service in each direction. So a real step up, and in association with that, there will be new rolling stock, and we're looking at car parking capacities and other aspects. So a real step change in our railways, as well as the money that's been looked at through the City Region deal for improving the railway between Aberdeen and the Central Belt. 200 million been allocated, but no detail as yet as to what that will look like. but we think the output from it will be a 20-minute reduction in journey times. I know not as much as James would like, but 20 minutes is certainly a first step to a vastly improved railway service between Aberdeen and Glasgow and Edinburgh. And obviously still to come, we've got commitments for a Hadigan. We've got commitments for dualling the A96 all the way between Aberdeen and Inverness, and grade separated junction at Lawrence Kirk, something that's been campaigned for a long time as well. And I think moving into the next phase, we really want to ensure that we get maximum benefit from that step change in infrastructure. And what I mean by that, I think, is some of what Derren was talking about. The city centre master plan talks about changing how the city centre works. At the moment, it's very much a through route for a lot of traffic. We would like to see that through traffic being moved to the western peripheral route, and the city centre starting to function as a destination rather than a part of the transport network as such. And we believe, allied to that, we need to be looking seriously at bus priority, traffic management, and think about the benefits that can bring in terms of air quality and the potential for a mode shift to encourage more people to walk, to cycle, to use public transport where appropriate. It's not an anti-car agenda, but it's about recognising that certain trips can be made more effectively by other modes. As part of that, we and the City Council will be looking at road hierarchy, changing the way that the city operates and how goods movement goes about, how strategic traffic moves about, and as I say, trying to maximise the Aberdeen Western Peripheral and the other benefits and investments that are coming through. Having said that, I still think there are continuing needs in the North East, and we will be continuing to press for these. The A90 north of Aberdeen, I think, is still vastly substandard. We've done a piece of work and believe that for a fairly modest investment, we could get significant benefits, particularly at the toll of Burness, but also in other aspects, improving access to Fraserburgh and Peterhead. We think there are potential for further rail enhancements, car parks, capacity on the trains, and potentially even new stations coming through over the next few years. The park and ride network still has a gap. We've got 4 significant bus-based park and ride sites, but nothing to the south. So we would still like to see a park and ride site, probably in the Portlethen area, where there is planning permission in principle for a site. An improvement to some of the roads, significantly, I think, the A947 and safety aspects, in addition to the routes I've already mentioned. We also know that there are technological and other changes coming, whether it's hydrogen buses or electric cars or potentially even autonomous vehicles. I'm not sure, but certainly we need to be able to embrace the changes that are coming. And I think there are also going to be legislative changes which have significant influence on us, whether that be an imposition of low emission zones or something else which will enforce changes to the way we travel about, or whether it's governance issues, whether they decide that Nastrans are no longer needed and that actually they would rather do that type of cross-boundary work at central government, then we shall see. But so changes afoot, a lot in the short term, and in the longer term, I think still changes to come.
Okay, we've got your back, Rab, don't worry.
Cheers.
Last but not least, Belinda. Belinda's our Head of Economic Development and Protective Services in Aberdeenshire Council. Sits on a range of national groups, interacts with central government on a frequent basis, but also is involved in Regional Economic Strategy Group and works very closely with the Economic Development team in the city as well. So I think is perfectly placed to, I guess, give us a good rounded picture of the North East and our infrastructure needs and where we've been. So Belinda.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, James. I'm going to start off with to pick up on Derren's point about when we were negotiating for the city region deal, one of our key tactics was that every time anyone came from the UK government, when they landed in Aberdeen Airport, we then made sure they went to West Hill on one of the back roads, which we then explained to them was actually the normal road. It wasn't the back road that most people went on, and then brought them to West Hill, into King's Wells, and then into the city, and explained quite clearly to them that these were the drivers for the North East economy, but people were driving on roads at that standard. And I think that was one of the most important things we kept doing. And we made sure we did it to everyone that came in, ministers, everybody, because to them, they often didn't have that perception. They have a lot of perceptions about the North East, as we know, but certainly not an understanding of the infrastructure. So it did pick up on why we were trying to say in our SWOT analysis that our infrastructure was substandard. So what we had to do, though, under the city region deal was to make sure that there was a business case for that infrastructure improvement. So, you know, everyone gave us long lists of all the improvements they'd like to see in their infrastructure, but unless there was an economic outcome for that, we weren't going to get it. So what we did get, and Rab's touched on it, is transport. But we weren't able to prove definitively in lots of cases that the transport need was going to be required. And certainly, I know, and many of you know this, is that, you know, the perception is that what more do you need? You're getting a bypass. So a lot of the work that now will happen is to do the diligence around what more do we need, because once you've got a bypass, there will be other transportation needs, and Rab's mentioned many of them. So a lot of work will go into that. Digital was, and as again, all of us who live here know that our digital infrastructure is very much substandard. It is slow speeds if it relates to broadband, and certainly slow speeds, particularly when we were negotiating in terms of our telephone signals. Both have improved, but they are still substandard based on a world-class economy. And again, the City Region deal has provided up to 20 million to improve our digital infrastructure. And we've started to see significant changes. So the 20 million that came initially for the City Region deal has now been almost doubled by other forms and other places. So we've actually got significant additional money to now invest in the digital infrastructure. And the other key area I think that we're all now seeing is around the harbour investment. So when we were negotiating on behalf of the harbour for investment into the infrastructure around the Aberdeen Harbour expansion, the interesting thing was that, of course, we were then looking at still a thriving oil and gas sector with a significant need and capacity for subsea vessels. Now it's shifted to quite often looking at the cruise ship element as well, and where that potential might come. So that takes me on to my second points I wanted to bring up, which is that sometimes the infrastructure that we put in has to change, and change very rapidly for its purpose. So many of us are using infrastructure that was never used, never put in, because no one had a perception that we would have a digital economy or a transport requirement that we currently have. So what we're now seeing is that when we were talking about super fast broadband, it now has to be ultra fast broadband. You cannot have just catch up. We must jump the curve and get beyond that. And similarly, in terms of the harbour development, we now need to have infrastructure that can cope with, let's say, 20 coaches leaving the harbour all at the same time with tourists who must feel that this is a place that was worth coming to, because we know from, not that I'm gone on a cruise ship, but as soon as they get back to the cruise ship, they're asked, was that a worthwhile visit? And if they get negatives, that cruise ship will never come back. And again, we've lost that opportunity. So it's about accepting that the changes of our infrastructure we must change the use of our infrastructure as we invest in it, but there's still a lot more to do.
So for the rest of the session, this is kind of between me and these guys and you and these guys. So if you want to ask them a question at any point, just put your hand up. But you've got some remote controls. I'm just going to start you off with a question, actually, just to look to the future. So this question really, I guess summarises that we have significant infrastructure investment taking place. But in your view, what's the key priority looking forward? So press the button which you most think to be pertinent. Is it rail, road improvements, more commercial infrastructure, social infrastructure? We've not spoken a lot about that. Schools, healthcare, accommodation, digital, which Belinda mentioned, or more tourism infrastructure, hotels and beds. So when I press this button now, you have 10 seconds. Okay, and the answer, we'll love the roads up here, love them. Let's get some roads done. I'm going to ask Rab this question. So, having been away from Aberdeen and come back, I wonder whether you think the region behaves as a city region or a town region in terms of its use of roads and cars.
Yeah. Thank you. My first note is that 65% of people voted for transport, so we're up there.
Yeah.
City region or a town region? Yeah, I mean, I still think there is a feeling that Aberdeen is wedded to the car. Aberdeenshire has, I think, the highest car ownership per household in the whole of Scotland. And in terms of car as a mode share, travel to work, I think from memory, Newmarket has the highest share of car use of any town or village in Scotland. I guess it's that sort of distance where a car journey is so much more efficient, easier than a bus journey. It's too far to cycle for most people. There's no railway station, so yeah, of course it does. I think the lowest, for example, is actually St Andrews. Now, do we want to live in a town, an area, which has good walking, cycling infrastructure, has jobs close to where people live, has good bus options, has rail options? You know, and I for one, think that we should be trying to encourage people where they can, where it's appropriate, to walk, to cycle, to use the bus, and make sure choices are available for people. I myself was very grateful this morning to have a choice when I couldn't get my car out of Portlathon. I managed to jump on the train and get here just about in time. I suppose then, directly trying to answer your question, I think we probably do almost think of it like a town where it is so easy to move about by car. But, you know, again, to emphasise that Aberdeen has something approaching a third of households who don't have access to a car. So, you know, we need to make sure that we are planning for and catering for all modes of travel. Even businesses, you know, if they're moving to a big new location, whether it's Prime 4 or whatever, yeah, it's great, there's car parking for the senior managers, but can the apprentices, can the cleaners, can the receptionists access that location for 7:30 in the morning? And I think we need to work better to make sure that choices are available. I don't know if that answered your question or not, James.
Yeah, no, you said it's a town region, not a city region, so that's written down. But you're not anti-car. You did say that earlier, so don't worry everybody quite yet. Belinda, I'm just wondering, because this kind of goes through your neck of the woods to the south, the Central Belt journey time, how's your perception of that moving on, and you know, how important is that to people up here?
So we're pretty used to all just getting on a train and sitting for 2.5 hours to get to a meeting. And then we're all very, very used to people assuming that we can get there for 10 o'clock in the morning, which obviously, yeah, if you get up at 5 in the morning sort of thing. So there is a desire, definitely, for both economic reasons, because so many of us need to get to the Central Belt for meetings, and for business reasons, to improve the rail infrastructure speed to the south. One of the City Region Deal side agreements was that as Rab has mentioned, was to invest in that rail infrastructure. Some work has been done on that by Transport Scotland, which is to look at what are the options, where would that investment of 200 million be best spent. But certainly from us as local authorities, and I think on behalf of everyone else, what we need to do is continue to lobby for that to happen, and happen soon. We have it written down that they will do it within 10 years. It's whether they can find a solution that will actually do that in 10 years. And Rab knows better than anyone else, and many of us, is that, you know, closing a rail line to improve it is not going to be a minor matter. For example, we're closing the rail line to Dice next year for 3 months because we want to dual it. So that you know, it does take time. Yeah.
Okay. In Drysdale, I had a conversation with a guy called Stephen Boyle, who's now one of the experts on the financial policy group for Aberdeen City Council, who said that spending money on rail is a terrible idea and it should be spent on roads. I disagreed with him. but he's a more famous economist than me, so obviously he's right. Is it a good spend of money? 220 million on a small bit of rail between Aberdeen and Glasgow and Edinburgh?
I think, just to draw a comparison, I was a student here at Aberdeen University, and I think the train time's the same as it was when I was a student in 1976. So it's remarkable how little improvement there's been over the years in terms of the connectivity. But yes, when you look at HS2, they're talking about spending £56 billion to improve journey times by 20 minutes between Birmingham and London. So I mean, the spend is seen as providing huge economic benefit. Yeah? There's much smaller spend here as well.
And that's the view within government, that this is good money to spend.
I think the bigger question is how the government is going to fund the A96 and the A9. At present, they've got £6 billion worth of road to build, and we don't know yet how they're going to fund that.
Okay. Probably at higher income tax rates from all our very handsome audience. We've another question here, which Drysdale mentioned about the European Investment Bank. It's obviously, it has been, a great source of funding for the region, but it will, one of the natural things of Brexit is you leave some of these opportunities behind. So some of you will be involved in this space, but do you have views on how that gap is best filled? Is it through bond issues? We're also, I guess, aware, a lot of us, of the bond issue that the City Council have delivered, some specific project financing from commercial sources. Pension funds, obviously, we're starting to see more of. We've had the proposal for a national investment bank in Scotland. It doesn't exist yet, or borrowing, and I guess there's been a little bit in the press about how local authorities spend their money. So if you press your buttons. Okay, interesting. So, Derren, you've probably seen a bit about all of these things in kind of your development head on. The bond issue was quite an innovation, I suppose, in terms of funding it, although I suppose the City Council would be at pains to say it didn't pay for the exhibition centre, but the numbers look pretty similar to me. But when you're looking at commercial projects, could you imagine using a national investment bank backed by the Scottish Government or proposed by them, or would you rather go down that commercial investment route?
I think you've got to look at each case on a sort of project by project basis at the end of the day. I mean, Aberdeen's a perfect example. We've seen a whole range of funding mechanisms in place to see what's happened. You've got Marshall Square, which was done on an income strip basis with an institutional pension fund. The City Council then decided to use the bond for the exhibition and conference centre. We were touching on County as Wells earlier on. That was government-linked infrastructure guarantees. And then you've got the likes of Broadford Works, which I understand is coming from American money. So it's, you've seen the full sort of suite recently in Aberdeen. And I think, Scottish Government and UK Government will be working hard to kind of fill that gap of, any European funding going forward. But, there's, despite the sort of political uncertainty, I think last year there was something like 66% of the investment in the commercial property sector across the UK was from overseas, and it was only about 30% for the sort of 15 years prior to that. So you're seeing a whole raft of overseas money. So it's just really working on a kind of project by project basis.
And in Drysdale, I mean, things like PFI and PPP haven't got a great public reputation. You work closely with the Futures Trust. Yeah. Have they made a difference? Are these things just money passing through different people's hands in slightly different or in the same ways?
There is one, I suppose, PPP type transaction is just one means of procuring assets by a government or a local authority. So I think only about 10% of the infrastructure over the last 10 years in the UK has been procured by a PPP type structure. So they're just one of the many means of procuring assets. I suppose in terms of the funding market itself, that on the European Investment Bank side of things, that the reckoning is that they lend into the UK about £7 billion a year, but the thinking is that they actually have been crowding out commercial banks in terms of funding because they're cheaper, but the necessity for their funding is reckoned to be diminishing because there's much more competition now in the market and the rates are coming down. Okay. So it may not be the end of the world that the EIB can't lend into the market anymore.
So you think the private sector may just step in?
Yeah, I think the private sector will step in and take up the slack. And in terms of the sort of futures trust and the yes, PPP type transactions have got a bad name, I think in part because the early PFI transactions, when soft services such as cleaning were provided by the private sector, caused issues with the unions. But I think nowadays the structure works in about 160 countries around the world, so it's got a bad press in the UK for various reasons, but it's used everywhere else in the world to great effect. So it's just another funding mechanism. Just
before I bring Rab in, I mean, put your hands up if you're, I guess, familiar with Scottish Futures Trust and what they do. A couple of almost embarrassed hands. I guess that's something that, you know, as a group of people interested in infrastructure, it's not a great thing that nobody knows what they are and what they do. So maybe there's a seminar for Brodies in that. I'm just going to ask you, Rab, and it may be a little bit unfair, but I'll do it anyway. Around infrastructure funding and I guess the court case that was recently won or lost, depending on which side you sit on, around infrastructure funding in the North East. And then what does that mean for the proposed infrastructure levy at a Scottish level, and how do you see big strategic projects being funded moving forward?
Yeah, it probably is unfair. No, happy to pick up on it. Yeah, the Nastrans and the councils had a strategic transport fund, which was, I suppose, a levy from major developments towards infrastructure, which wasn't on our existing list of schemes that we were planning to do, but were required to enable that strategic development. It was based on the principle that everyone would chip in a little bit, and collectively we would be able to deliver schemes that couldn't otherwise be delivered. So I think it's fair to say that some in the development industry felt that long-term uncertainty and understanding was beneficial. There was others that felt, well, there was lawyers who felt, including judges, who felt that it wasn't legal within the current legislation. So it was lost. What does it mean for us? It means an 80 million black hole, which we will not be able to deliver additional infrastructure under. In terms of a future levy, I understand that they're still looking at potentially nationally a future levy, and obviously they're planning bill going through at the moment. So if it's a good idea and the only problem was it wasn't legal, they've got an opportunity to change the law. I don't know if they're going to do that because I don't know what's in the planning bill. In terms of going forward, for me, the big schemes we've spoken about have been primarily the responsibility of the Scottish Government, Transport Scotland. Rail schemes, trunk roads are very much a Scottish Government question, and therefore for us it's really about continuing to make the case that investment in infrastructure in the North East of Scotland is for the good of Scotland as a whole and the UK. I think we need to ensure that we continue to get our fair share of that budget. You know, whether 220 million on a railway is as good value as billions on a high-speed rail coming as far as Scotland, you know, I think we might have a different view from someone sitting in Glasgow or Edinburgh. But I think we need to continue to campaign to get our fair share. Belinda mentioned the phrase business cases, you know, that we don't just have an open wish list of wanting everything. We've actually been very careful to say these are the things we need and these are the things we can make a positive business case for. We haven't said, let's have trams, let's have tunnels, let's have etc. I'm sure, you know, any group of 30-odd people could come up with a wish list of 30 or 40 pet schemes, but we haven't done that. We've very much been about, can we make a business case and secure funding which will be a benefit to the economy across the country.
Okay, yeah, Belinda?
I just wanted to add that the Department of Trade and Industry were here a few months ago they're trying to package up key significant investment opportunities for the UK. Because there's more money in the world than there is investment projects available for them. So that strikes you quite hard, because then at the same time, you know, the public sector, and I'm glad everyone said 3%, there's only 3% of you felt that the public borrowing is going to actually deal with our infrastructure. It's not. I mean, we all know the public purse is not going to be able to afford all these things. So maybe the controversial point is that we in Scotland, in this part of the region, have to actually think completely differently about how we're going to attract plenty of inward investment to both commercial developments, but potentially also to just infrastructure developments.
Yeah, a matchmaking exercise.
Yeah.
So there's going to be no tram or tunnel out to this place, but this is my generation's Union Terrace Gardens, clearly. So the football stadium, this is the one that I didn't know had slipped in. So what do you think the benefits are of the relocation? None at all, should state Pittodrie. And some of you, of course, may know nothing about this if you're not a football fan. Relocating will allow that area to regenerate, new housing. The biggest benefits, the training academy and the community aspects out at Kingsford. Or, I guess, put simply, the construction jobs. So press your buttons now. I'm pretty sure not all of you are pressing those buttons, but I don't know which ones aren't. Okay, so most do see some benefit. Derren, with your kind of city hat on, how do you square a circle on these kind of things in terms of momentum and investor confidence, and what projects like this show about the region being open for business versus, you know, that perception of people walking about the city centre before a game and spending money, and will their behaviours change and things?
Yeah, no, I mean it is vital that Aberdeen get a new football stadium. There's no two doubts about that. You can just spend some time in Pittodrie and see that we're way behind the curve, and also their lack of training facilities is, you know, it's difficult to try and attract those best players. They've done a fantastic job as they have just now. I guess the hats off the club. They've got control of a very good, prominent site. It's very accessible by cars, as we spoke about, but yeah, perhaps lack that other infrastructure there. I mean, I think, you know, we obviously don't know what's going on behind the scenes. I think it would be great if the City Council could work in partnership with the club. I guess a good example is in Liverpool just now, where the local City Council are working with Everton to relocate their football stadium closer to the city centre. And I think they're actually, because they get preferential borrowing rates, they're actually lending the money to the football club to build that stadium. So I can totally understand the rationale to press ahead with the site. I think if you know, of course, if something could be fast-tracked closer to the city centre, then there would be a lot of people in favour of that. But I think it is key that a development happens in some shape or form for the club and for the city.
And Belinda, just quickly, how do you deal with stuff like this around that peripheral route? And, you know, we've all driven around bypasses. I know it's not a bypass, Rab, sorry, but all around the UK, and they get blocked up with development. It is going to be a development corridor. How do we kind of go across that city-shire boundary when you jump across each side of the road and make sure development's appropriate and well managed?
I'm not a planner, so I'm not going to even dare go into that, and there's two sitting eyeballing me, so I'm definitely not going to do that bit. Having said that, you know, the reality is we are a city region and we're going to have to grow. And, you know, I'm sure when they built North Anderson Drive, they thought that was going to be the edge of the city, and, you know, it's now the heart of the city. So in reality, you know, future generations will need land. They will need space for commercial and housing developments. I think it's going to be inevitable that we just have to accept that AWPR will provide more places for that development. And Derren did also already mention Black Dog, and that's a perfect case where, you know, it's a perfect site at the end of the junction with the Balmedy Tipperty. It was inevitably, and it just happened to come earlier than probably people expected. So I think it's about understanding that, but it's probably going to have to bring the community's expectations along with us on that as well.
Okay. And just before I go on to the next question, there was obviously, I'm guessing, 6 of you, at least 5, who said there would no benefit. Anybody care to say? No? Okay. Just thought I'd ask. You know, audience participation and all that. Okay, so just a quick turn to some tourism. I suspect there'll be some consensus on this one. So we've got these big projects, art gallery, music hall, city centre master plan, and it's about the place of Aberdeen, making it more attractive. So what's your views on that? You know, are these good projects, or should we actually be investing in other types of infrastructure, social infrastructure? Is it kind of critical that these happen within the city centre boundaries, or should there be more equitable in terms of financial spread of investment on these types of projects? So press your buttons. Okay, so pretty strong view there. Drysdale, when you look around the UK at the kind of projects you've been involved with, and they are in that social economic space, do they tend to increasingly be driven into city to make city regions work, or do you see things spread more widely? Has there been a change over time?
I guess cities are the places that people want to live, aren't they? So I mean, that's where the facilities have to be. So you have to build better facilities for the increasing population to meet the demand from the economy.
And Belinda, how do you square that one in terms? Because I guess Aberdeenshire is a city region area, but actually there's bits which I'd say are kind of not part of the city region when you go up to the north coast and, you know, Banff and even Fraserburgh.
Yeah, and I suppose that any of us that either work or live closer to Aberdeen or within the city, you forget the fact that people often come from different parts. So the benefits of getting to Banffshire, probably people are coming from Murray or from Inverness. So, you know, we always, with our heads on, think everyone must spread out of the city, but they're not. They're not going to do that. And, you know, particularly the more sort of Cairngorm Park sort of side of things, they're more likely to be coming on a day trip from Aviemore or to maybe come that way. But in terms of this question, I mean, I'm sure I'm the same as the majority there, which is that you must have a thriving city and you must have a thriving cultural centre, as you would do if it's in Inverurie or it's in Peterhead. So all of us in the public sector have to make sure that whatever places it is that we're looking after have that cultural offering, because that's what makes quality of life. That's what means that we can keep attracting people to work here.
Okay. And just the final question. We've got can't have an event without a question on Brexit. So, what do we think the impact of Brexit will have on the region and on investment and infrastructure in the region? So nothing. Some kind of increase in cost of capital, workers. Actually, will we have issues building projects? Contracting issues, so people find it more difficult to actually operate here. Discouragement of investment, or just simply things like increased import prices. So use your remote controls, please. Okay, so no kind of one obvious one, but a range of impacts, which I guess reflects a lot of the discussion on Brexit anyway. I mean, Rab, when you're going and pricing jobs, basically, as you do at your early stages of these feasibility studies, how much is this stuff playing into your mind at the moment, or do you just have to ignore it and live in a world which is today, and because we don't know what's happening in the future?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, very much looking at things as have been. So yeah, I haven't really been looking at things and what if we have to pay more, or what if, etc. We are involved in European projects, and I guess there's a concern immediately about what happens about European projects that we're involved in. But yeah, in terms of the longer term, I think that, to be honest, just an uncertainty, certainly from my perspective.
And Derren, in that earlier question we had, that we should be looking at source more, I guess, European corporate banking type money and funding. Do you get a sense that people have a less of an appetite overseas, or are we still a good place to come and do business?
I mean, certainly, you know, we've got offices across major UK cities, and they are all motoring just now. You know, okay, Aberdeen perhaps slightly different, but Birmingham, Manchester office, you know, our Leeds office, London, the volumes of investment's been, you know, substantial. Everyone was, you know, sort of panic stations post Brexit, but there's a lot of money coming into the UK. And I think, you know, there's obviously, you've seen the likes of the Northern Powerhouse, and what we're actually finding more is, I think it's actually impacted in the sort of periphery of London. So we've got a team that look after around the M25, and they've had a few challenging years, and that's largely due to the fact that, you know, big occupiers are actually making the decision not to be based outside of London, but actually move to your Manchester, move to your Birmingham, because, you know, you can buy a flat for a reasonable price, and you've got a great city centre to live in. So I think, you know, certainly from a CBRE's perspective, the last couple of years have been very strong, despite what's been going on in the political landscape.
Okay, I'm going to have to close it. We started a little bit late, so we've probably lost 5 minutes, but I'll make sure you don't lose that your work day. Could I just ask you to put your hands together for a panellist, please? So thanks to Brodies for hosting these 4 events. It's been good fun. Got me free breakfast 4 times. Got a good opportunity for me to wind up 16 people who I barely know. So thanks to the team. The YouTube video, which I was meant to tell you about at the start actually, that's going to be online and you've been streamed live, but none of you have said anything controversial, so it's all good. You can go back to work and be safe in your career. The end of this phase of our Vanguard process takes place on Tuesday. We've got a conference where 8 groups are presenting their business cases for what they see as key projects for the region, so things like improvements of Union Street, how to make a great cultural environment within the North East, and you'll probably hear more about that after the event, and some of you will be coming to it. Brodies have pushed out the boat and allowed me to celebrate the end of this event with a popper, so thank you very much everybody. So, you've been part of the Ultimate Party Network. Enjoy the rest of your business day. Thank you.